seats. We're going to get started here. Later, 7 o'clock hour. So every month we have really some fascinating talks. Tonight's certainly going to be part of that. Another fascinating talk. This is Corbin Senior Center, named after D.C. Corbin. Are you going to talk about the Corbin Field? Okay.
Did you have an announcement?
So,
no, we just need to hear.
We can't hear anything.
Can't hear anything.
could you hear the rest of the program earlier?
No.
Barely.
Barely. Okay. Loud. Well, I know because we're loud. If you'd like to sit.
I'm going to move.
Okay, I turned up that mic. Is that better? Good, there's no feedback. Sometimes when I turn it up, there's feedback and we have to turn it back down. But tonight, that sounds like that actually worked. So that's good. I should have done that earlier. I'm afraid of the feedback issue, though. Alrighty, well, tonight we've got another great program, and it's something that's pretty exciting because it's something that is really a tribute to Spokane. And the Corbin Field, the Corbin Park over here is part of this horse racing history that's pretty interesting to learn. So I'm going to have Maggie introduce our speaker.
Are we going to be able to have him stand by his computer? Can he stand by his computer? Oh, you got a clicker? So uptown.
Well, this guy impresses me and continues to impress me. I am so excited tonight. We pick our programs from people like you that tell me, wouldn't it be fun if we did Kentucky Derby night? Let's talk about Kentucky Derby. And I went, yeah, let's do it. Let's get hats and juleps. Here, come on, let's do it. And look, you did it. Here we are, right? Build it and we will come. Good job, guys. And if you're going to have something about Kentucky Derby, we need to talk about horse racing. But we don't want to talk about the Kentucky Derby. That's way over in Lexington, Kentucky. What about the horses right here? And if we're going to have someone talk about horse racing in Kentucky, we need to talk about the man in Spokane, Washington that was the expert and the historian, the sports writer for the Spokesman Review, and that is Mr. Jim Price. And he is our speaker tonight. Jim and I know each other from way back. He and his wife Ann and I were good friends and colleagues, and Jim has had an astounding career as a sports writer in Spokane, and he was the voice of Playfair. And with that, I am going to introduce to you Mr. Jim Price and let him tell you more.
And we're off. It's a real privilege to be here this evening, and I have to admit, since I did know the subject was horses, though, I did not expect to immediately be greeted by a picture of Miski of Chincoteague. For those of you who read children's books a long time ago, like many of you, maybe all, or both, I've been driven by curiosity and way too much interest in way too few things for almost all of my life. And sometimes, of course, information can be a good thing, sometimes life gets in the way, and sometimes you get in the way of life. And sometimes it interferes. But if you'd like to know, say for example, that in 1947, because I've been collecting information for a very long time, if you'd like to know in 1947 how many New York State license plates I saw in Los Angeles, see me afterward. Everything I've done professionally involved collecting information and redistributing it one way or another, starting with weekly newspapers and daily newspapers, racetracks, baseball parks, Eastern Washington University, and then back to the Spokesman Review. I had my first byline in a daily newspaper in 70 years ago. I had my first story in the Spokesman Review 60 years ago. And, but today's meeting really recognizes the upcoming 150th anniversary of the Kentucky Derby, which for the past century has been recognized for 3-year-old thoroughbreds in this country is the first race in the Triple Crown, which is the Kentucky Derby in Lexington, Kentucky, the Preakness Stakes in Baltimore, and the Belmont Stakes in New York State, New York City outskirts. So I had thought, well, maybe I would have to ask you if you could name a Kentucky Derby winner, but then since I know you're well prepared, not only with the horse statues on your table, but one of them is actually named Spokane, who did win the 15th Kentucky Derby in 1889. He was bred, born, and raised and trained in Montana by his owner-breeder, Noah Armstrong. The horse was named Spokane because Mr. Armstrong was in this city on business the day the horse was born. But really the most extraordinary thing, other than the fact that this relatively little named horse and known horse from Montana went to Kentucky and won the Kentucky Derby in a, they didn't have photo finishes in those days, but he won by a nose over the previous year's 2-year-old champion, a fine horse named Proctor Knott, at the odds of 10 to 1. In the next several weeks after that, he beat Proctor Knott twice more, each time by even more destination. But the really extraordinary thing about Spokane, the horse, or at least relation to that, is despite 135 years of inflation, can you imagine that the citizens of this city, and county I suppose, honoring this horse, spent $5,000 to buy him a souvenir blanket for the owner and the horse. And some of you have maybe seen that. The museum, Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture, has had possession of the blanket for many years, and occasionally it is on display. There have been 13 Triple Crown winners over the last 130 or 40 years. The interesting thing is that 8 of the 13 took place in the space of about 35 years. The last of those 8 was the famous horse of some of our young years, the horse named Citation that belonged to the famous Calumet Farm. Then it was another 25 years before Secretariat won the Triple Crown. And then in short order, 5 years later, and then the year after that, it was done twice more. And then there was a gap of 35 years before the Triple Crown was won by American Pharoah in 2015. And now it was 3 years before Justify won again. And so they comes in clumps. There is just absolutely no rhyme or reason of how it happens, other than the fact that it is more difficult these days for a horse to win all 3 races, or even for the best horse to win the Kentucky Derby, because the Derby now usually has very large fields, and there's a lot of traffic congestion, and it becomes more difficult, even in that one race, for the best horse to win. As you might guess, as settlers and military forces joined the Native Americans around here in what became the city and county of Spokane, horses of all sorts were really important and, of course, ubiquitous. People rode them, they could pull plow, they could help graze and range land, and occasionally pull the family buggy. And some of them, a few of them, could run fast. Though with the growing sense and need of population and interest in having some sense of community, it was important to have some sort of celebration. And in those days of the 1870s and early 1880s, when we're still fairly close to the country having celebrated its 100th anniversary, is the big celebration around here was on the 4th of July. And almost always that took place at the eastern entrance to Brown's Addition, where the land was flat and it stretches most of the way almost to the point where First Presbyterian Church stands today, right near where Anthony Cannon's house was. And there were picnic grounds, there were play fields, there were fields for other areas of physical activity, and there was a baseball diamond and all kinds of things like that. And there were horse races, a great collection of animals belonging to farmers and ranchers and military people who would station at the nearby post, and Native Americans and the few scattered adult well-to-do people who had begun to gather here as business people and had a horse that they thought was fast enough. So, because both Sprague and Riverside, pretty primitive at the time of course, nonetheless ran straight as a string almost to the corner of Monroe and Riverside, where the Spokesman Review building stands right now, they could run out and back as fast as they could go, making the turn and come back again. And was there pushing and shoving and bouncing around a little bit? Yes. Was there an occasional gunshot to make a horse run faster? Sure. And was there betting? Well, of course there was. Eventually, encouraged by the arrival of the railroads, profitable businesses, wholesale and retail began to dominate the city, and some of the affluent professionals and business people imported racehorses and needed a place to show off what they had. Originally, influenced by the transplanted Midwesterners and Easterners, those horses were almost always harness horses, trotters or pacers. Trotters alternate their feet, pacers with moving both left legs and then both right legs. And they would pull a low-slung sulky. Thoroughbreds had been pretty slow to speed to the west for a variety of reasons, and most of those at the time, most of the professional commercial racing of thoroughbreds on the west coast was in the San Francisco area. By then, however, spreading east to west, horse racing had become the country's most popular spectator sport, and jockeys were the highest paid professional athletes, because other than baseball, there wasn't much competition. Football and basketball were in their infancy, and of course all the modern entertainments that we've enjoyed all of our lives, movies and television and the internet and all the other things that can bother us and take our time up now, hadn't even been invented. So I'm going to bring up some unfamiliar names, and many of them from the past, and some, if you paid any attention to the horses in your time here in the Spokane area, you're going to recognize some of those. But just out of curiosity, how many of you are horse racing fans? Or went to the races with occasionally or now and again? Well, as you know, if you spend any time at the track, and the rest of you may be interested to know that, one, the whole sport essentially is built around the men and the women who owned horses, who trained horses, and rode horses. And I can say from personal experience, it's really a lot of fun to work at the racetrack, let alone be there. It's a very democratic place, so like the acting business, you can you need to be nice to the people on the way up, because you might meet them again on the way down. And a man who has no good horses, or a woman who has no good horses in their 2 or 3 horse stable today, might have a wonderful horse in a year or two, and sometimes they do. So here by the mid-1980s, the city and the county had begun to reach critical mass, and so the local harness racing crowd had sort of formed 3 groups, all of these involved with harness horses. The Gentlemen's Driving Club, the Spokane Driving and Riding Club, and the Falls City Rating Club, hoping to compete with the nation's, or the region's best rather, harness racing at the time, which currently was taking place in Portland. To do that, they needed a racetrack. So it was, early in that decade, a primitive track was laid out just about a block and a half east of here. For more than a century, we've known this site, of course, as Corbin Park. A few years later from this time, 1880 or so, A.J. Ross, a key figure in the Exchange National Bank, who owned harness horses, developed a kite-shaped track for he and his friends could train their horses on the bluff southeast of the Perry neighborhood. Presumably, it was just a hard, flat surface looping south to north, used, as I said, for training purposes. There's no record of any official races taking place there, and soon the course was surrounded by homes, and we know it, of course, as the Altamont neighborhood. Population growth had led to demands for entertainment too, and in those days, that meant a fair. First, in June 1886, Francis Cook, the enterprising newspaper man and real estate investor, put together a board to plan what they decided to call the Washington and Idaho Fair. And he started work on a race course in part of his 700 South Hill acres, with plans for an agricultural fairground to follow. Well, first, as that began to happen, and he started work on that, as I said, so in June, as I said, they started work, and then, however, Cook's Spokane and Montrose streetcar lines and the Spokane Cable Railway were still 3 years away. So as summer began, the directors got cold feet. Instead, They bought the 15 acres that surrounded that dirt track on the north side, improved the half-mile track, developed a fairground that included a landscape infield, a baseball diamond, barns, exhibit halls, and along the south straightaway, between Cleveland and the edge of the raceway itself, a grandstand. 2 months late, the fair began on September 21st, 1886. Racing continued there for the next 2 years, was canceled because of the Great Fire the next year and by the Great Exposition the year after that. And it didn't resume until 1891 when the Spokane Fair and Agricultural Association took over the management and operated there through the next 3 or 4 years. Then, along with Cook's vast holdings, the fair became a victim of the panic of 1893. A typical race card in those days began and ended with a harness race with a thoroughbred race in between. Just 3 races? Why so fewer? Well, if you've seen harness racing, you know that harness horses run flat-footed and therefore need a hard, flat, packed surface. Thoroughbreds run on tilled soil. And so between every race, harness to thoroughbred, thoroughbred to harness, they had to groom and regroom the racetrack. So in between, there were a variety of entertainments in between, bicycle races, baseball games, jugglers, and whatnot. So, but if you know Corbin Park well, it's natural to wonder how on earth, if you've seen as it stands now with the curves there, you wonder how on earth could a racing thoroughbred horse make it around those turns? They didn't. And the reason is because after the fair ended and the racing ended a year or 2 later, Daniel Corbin reclaimed and took over the whole property in a fire sale, essentially, and wanted to redevelop all the land around it. So he donated the park to the city, and in order to meet the streets, have the streets on the north and south sides of the track, the north straightaway was moved south in order to meet the city grid that was on both sides of it. So no, racing thoroughbreds did not go around those turns. And now the backstretch, of course, is Park Place. During the fair's second season, the Spokane Derby debuted on October 12, 1887 with a purse of $450. With a couple of interruptions, it became the longest lasting thoroughbred stakes race in the entire West. And although this picture is taken from later years, this is very typical of how that went on once that grandstand had been built as we moved into the next century. And you can see the Kentucky Derby days with the Kentucky Derby queen, always the daughter of a prominent family, with all of her pals from various women's group and tea parties and the like. And so that they all would gather and they would crown the winner of the Kentucky Derby. Oops, oh, what have I done? They would crown the winner of the Spokane Derby and hang a floral wreath around his neck, and then the jockey had to dismount and take his saddle off to weigh in to make sure that he carried the right weight, and then he would remount the horse bareback, ride to the center of the track, pick the silk purse, red and white in color always, from the wire hanging down across the finish line, and then he would pull down the purse with the winner's share of the purse, and then go back and walk off the track. The Derby in those days was not like the format we know today, which Derbies are always races for 3-year-olds. So those races, until the modern days when Playfair Racecourse opened, the race was almost always open to horses of all ages, and the distances frequently changed. And as you know, by the 1890s, Spokane was rapidly expanding towards its goal of 100,000 by 1910. Growth promoted prosperity, and the business community had recovered by then starting to from the disasters of the 1889 fire and the Panic of '93. So a much larger fairground was developed on 63 acres east of downtown, wedged between, as it still is today, between the crisscrossing railroad tracks at Altamont and Maine. That's the grandstand. Kirtland Cutter designed the grandstand, and with Governor John R. Rogers on hand, after a late morning parade, Does anybody ever do anything like this anymore? With the late morning parade from Riverside and Monroe, the Spokane Interstate Fair opened an 11-day run on September the 10th, 1901. There were 9 days of harness and thoroughbred racing on the half-mile racetrack. The Spokane Derby was renewed 4 days later. Many memorable things have happened there on and off the track. Regionally and sometimes nationally prominent horse owners, jockeys, and trainers campaigned there. There were bicycle and auto races, trick riders, and demonstration airplane flights. But when it comes to horses, you really only need to know about 6. They are Cyclonic, Lighted Way, Collaborator, now we're getting to the modern times, Turbulator, Black Mackie, and Black Mackie's daughter, Miss Mackie. Early in the century, around the country, there was far less commercial racing in those days, and most of that was confined to spring, fall, usually late fall, and winter, because almost every county fair in the entire country had a few days of horse racing, and there was no competition to speak of. So usually starting out with a couple of harness races, and then have relay races, often relay races for men, one every day of the fair until they had a winner at the end of the week, for big money actually, and one for women. And it wasn't until the mid-1920s that thoroughbreds began to dominate the programs. Always attempts to hold the fair lasting as long as a couple of weeks was really bound to fail, so eventually the Spokane Interstate Fair confined itself to 5 or 6 days as the common. And because most commercial tracks were idle during the fair season, many of the race meets, even here, included a few quality stables of horses, and on occasion, top-flight jockeys. In 1903, a jockey named Merritt Buxton, chased out of Northern California for overly aggressive riding, that's usually whipping other riders with your whip, rode 12 winners in 6 days, and 10 years later, he led the nation in races won and money earned. In 1909, as a reaction to bookmaking, really a conflict of interest that encouraged corruption and a heavy desire to see heavy favorites lose. The state barred bookmaking in that fashion. And as a result, face-to-face wagers were the only way to bet on the horses after that for many years. Spokane interests counted by developing a 1-mile track with a steel grandstand across the state line in Idaho, which hadn't joined the band. Named after the nearby railroad siding where Interstate 90 now intersects the state highway, the Allen track actually wasn't developed, the land wasn't until about 15 years ago. The Allen track opened a 36-day season on September 11, 1911. Racing continued through October with a 1-week break for the Interstate Fair, coupled with the Meadows, the Seattle area track that became part of Boeing Field. The second longest meet, the 2 long meets, really improved the quality of Northwest racing almost at once. The Idaho track attracted a few large stables from Juarez, Mexico, the Midwest, Montana, and Canada. Some horses had national reputations. The most important of those that we would know about, it was a Pan Zarata, who became a legend. She started 151 times in her racing career, won 76 races, competing in 8 states and a couple of countries, and she won at the Allen track during her 2-year-old campaign. And in 1913, after winning in Idaho, Lady Panchetta came across the state line, another nationally known hard-knocking mare, who's also pretty well known historically, won here in the Spokane Derby. And at the 1917 fair, oops, can I go back? No. At the 1917 fair, just missed his picture, a farm boy from Milan named Albert Johnson rode for the first time. He went east a year or 2 later, rode 2 Kentucky Derby winners, and ended up in the Horse Racing Hall of Fame. By the mid-teens, commercial racing had increased to the point where, with the help of the fairs, there was wall-to-wall racing almost everywhere, somewhere on the entire continent. But almost as suddenly, even sooner than Prohibition, gambling on commercial races of any kind was outlawed almost everywhere. County fairs survived, however, Spokane, the Derby festivities and all began happening in bunches of three. George Drumheller of Walla Walla, the state's first important thoroughbred breeder and trainer, and owner, won the Spokane Derby 3 straight years, 1919 to 1921. Immediately afterward, the father-son team of owner-trainer G.F. Hearn of Muskogee, Oklahoma, and his jockey sons, Paul and Dave, won the next 3. Paul was only 14 years old when he rode the family's 7-year-old mare, Audrey Kay, to prevail in a 4-horse finish in 1922. Then, I just missed her accidentally, then the Northwest first female trainer, Ruth Barton, once a champion relay rider herself, became a horse owner as well as trainer, and by the end of the decade, her best horse, Cyclonic, had won the race, the Spokane Derby, 3 straight times. You can see older horses are allowed. 1928 to 1930. In 1930, the 3rd time, Cyclonic won the Derby easily, broke the track record for 1.25 miles, and then went on to win the Derbies in Yakima and Salem in the next few weeks, running his winning streak to about 6 races in a row, all of them handicap races. Weeks later, despite having drawn the 2nd largest crowds in history, this is 1930, the stakeholders, claiming they were acting proactively, they said, voted to discontinue the fair. Income hadn't kept up with expenses, and the big fairs, they said, would soon be a thing of the past. Racing would return, but the Spokane Interstate Fair did not for many, many years, and that, of course, was at a new facility. The facility was vacant, the fairgrounds, for 4 years, but the state of Washington, as they were many places across the country, thanks to the expenses and debts and deficits brought on by the Great Recession, made racetrack betting legal again. Seattle interests, somewhat better prepared, built a track on the edge of Renton in 28 days, and Long Acres, with pari-mutuel machines replacing bookmakers, opened on August the 3rd, 1933. It took Spokane another 2 years to revive the sport. Former bookmaker Irving Hildebrand, who had been involved in horse racing here and gambling for almost all the century, put together a group that was led by the Chrysler Plymouth dealers Guy and Dee Regal, hotel owners Vic Desert and Louis Davenport, and jeweler Oscar Levitch. At Levich's suggestion, they renamed the fairgrounds facility Playfair Track, and eventually, of course, that became Playfair Race Course. Ooh, there's Ruth, pardon. This was the starting gate at the first few years of racing under the Playfair name. This was a primitive by our standards today, but this was a pioneer electronic starting gate developed by a man named Clay Puget, who later was involved with the ownership of Turf Paradise in Phoenix, where I worked with him for a little while. The trick of this, you can see the padded sides on the edge of the stalls, the starting gate. This was what the pioneer factor was. This was the first electromagnetic thing where by pushing the button, the starter would release the magnets and the doors in front of the horses would fly open. And here also the beginning facilities when Playfair Racecourse began is that is the judges' stand at the right there. You can see one of the stewards in plain sight on the upper there, judging the finish line, and another in the back of the third is not pictured in there, but he'd be watching some other factor, probably the back part of the back of horses coming by. And you can see it's going to be a great finish. And on the left side of the screen, you see the primitive version of the totalizator board, which would show the betting odds and the winning prices at the end of the race. Many of those things, of course, were modernized much over the long time of years. Anyway, the racing began with a fresh coat of white and green paint on the weathered grandstand and a 16-day season they tried running every day, 7 days a week. On August the 30th, with Governor Clarence Martin in the crowd, Long Acres champion Bill Robertson rode 7 winners in the first 4 days and went on to win the riding championship for that first season. Joe Hernandez, who was the first person to have the job at every track on the West Coast, including Santa Anita, called the races. Soon after that, a future national champion jockey from Sunnyside, 15-year-old apprentice Basil James, who may be on the next slide, rode his first winner, and soon after that, 2 years later, he led the nation in riding victories. And the Spokane Derby was revived at the new track on Thursday, September 12th, with a horse named Chatter On galloped to a 4-length victory. Harry McGahan, who had been a successful rider here during the interstate fair days, and still was 3 decades later, during the later mid-course Playfair days, was his rider. Because there wasn't yet much racing between the Mississippi River and the Rockies, talent sometimes showed up in unexpected places. In 1937, Johnny Adams, an Arkansas native destined to be a Hall of Fame jockey and trainer, ran away with the riding championships at Long Acres and Playfair. The next year, 2 years after James, he led the nation. Then he did it twice more. There's Basil James. And he later occasionally rode at Playfair too in the 40s and the 50s, later in his career. So the 1938 Playfair Riding Championship was apprenticed with a wonderful name, Otis Augustus Dye Jr. By 1939, Gus Dye had found success in California, and he was a genuine star at tracks like Tanforan, Bay Meadows, and the new Hollywood Park, when gamblers tramped him and another former Playfair apprentice out from Idaho, Albert Seiler, in a race-fixing scheme that, with investigations, and court cases, was so publicized that it became the subject of an entire book. One of the leading writers here in 1940, apprentice Doug Dodson, went on to a Hall of Fame career writing primarily for Calumet Farm, which had had citation. And Calumet, of course, had a long career as the nation's leading stable, and as it turned out, although Dodson himself also went to the Racing Hall of Fame, he broke up with the Calumet Farm because he didn't get them out on citation. With 2 years off for World War II, allowing management to make some badly needed repairs to the grandstand, racing here resumed in 1944. The original lease had expired, so there was a new ownership operating as the Inland Empire Fair and Racing Association, which pretty much managed the track for almost the next 40 years. It had bought all of the fairgrounds except the northeast corner, where some of us, old enough, remember that Ferris Field, the baseball diamond, was in the corner up there. And more trainers and jockeys and officials began to look at the racetrack as year-round work, because Portland Meadows had opened in the Portland area, and also there were longer racing seasons beginning to develop at all of the tracks on the West Coast, as well as some other parts of the country. Before and after the war, with fairs still flourishing, the commercial tracks, Long Acres, Playfair, and Portland Meadows, found supplemental benefits from the Blue Mountain Circuit, which stretched from the Idaho-Oregon border and well into southeast Washington, including places like Union and Ontario, Oregon, Walla Walla, Dayton, Waitsburg, and Colfax, producing many of the region's top post-war jockeys, some of them future Playfair champions. After Portland Meadows had opened in 1946, then the Northwest became a well-established circuit, often combined with winter racing in Phoenix, and sometimes for the better stables in Northern California. Some Canadian stables came to Spokane for the final month of racing. Growth in the Washington and Oregon breeding industries made it possible then for Yakima Meadows to become a fourth commercial track in the early 1960s, starting in the spring of 1961. And the Northwest sport continued to grow annually from there, clear into the late 1980s. Soon, Playfair had its first real equine star, maybe as good, allowing for differences in style, is the front-running Cyclonic, had been in the final days of the interstate fair. Lighted Way, owned and trained by Cecil Jolly, who lived near Olympia, began his career as a 2-year-old in 1946 with 3 wins at Long Acres and Playfair. The next year, Jolly converted him into a stretch runner. The big chestnut gelding, who had a personality to grow with that big splash of white on his nose, found his way. For the year, he won 8 of his 15 starts and finished second or third in every one of the others. He won 4 of his 5 Playfair starts, beating older horses 3 times, and was beaten only a length in the Playfair Mile against older horses. With his help, attendance for the 30-day meet increased sharply, averaging 6,029 fans a day, with almost 11,000 of them on Spokane Derby Day and Mile Day. Then on closing day, Lighted Way carried 127 pounds and beat older horses again in the Washington State Breeders' Handicap. In the next 3 years, he won the Harvest Handicap twice more, the Breeders' Handicap a second time, and ran 1st, 3rd, and 4th in the Playfair Mile. By the time he retired in 1955, Lighted Way had started 127 times. You want to get popular? Show up frequently. 127 starts, 30 wins, 29 seconds, 18 thirds. His earnings ranked among the highest at the time for a Washington-bred horse. Today, his $46,296 would be
About $2 million.
more than $500,000. 46,000 to $500,000. By the mid-30s, by the mid-50s, as the industry continued to grow and areas of the country began to develop their own group of star jockeys, trainers, and horses, who ran often enough and year after year to develop a following. At Playfair, that meant jockeys like Harry McGahan, Harvey Duncan, Eddie Plesa, Vic DeVovine, Glenn Dixon, and 3-time champion Bud Simonis, and most of them raced here for a decade or more. On the management front, Playfair's management, by that point, had evolved into 2 factions. One headed by Frank Granger, the beer distributor who was the president and general manager. This group was satisfied with regular, slow growth and modest profits, but steady. The others were much more interested in the future, where they might have more racing days, better quality racing, larger purses for the horsemen, and larger attendance and larger handle. And that meant always, of course, more revenue for the state. And so, as this struggle continued, nonetheless, in 1954, improvements began. The clubhouse was created beneath the south part of the grandstand. And here you can see that would be the newer part on the right side of the grandstand there. That's the next phase of the clubhouse. The other clubhouse will be where you see the where to our left, at the end of the grandstand, right there beneath the last part of the roof. Then the clubhouse was built there, and there was a small bleacher at that end at that time originally. So then, in 1956, as a compromise, George C. Manus, son of the improvement-minded Vice President George G.S. Manus, was named Assistant General Manager, forcing Granger to share the power. 13 years later, Manus became the General Manager, and he served a quarter of a century. In 1962, emboldened by a further shift in the board members, Playfair added a well-appointed turf club that enclosed that southern end of the grandstand to the left of the words Playfair on the roof. And a modern entrance was added in 1965, and the parking lot was improved, new barns were built, and then a couple of years after that, new box seats were modernized, the sound system was updated, and flower beds began to decorate the infield. Here in this picture, this was actually taken in the mid-1940s. This was right after the track had been expanded from half a mile to 5/8 of a mile. And if you look carefully, you can see in the left-hand corner of the parking lot, upper left-hand corner of the parking lot, you can see a piece of the outfield of Ferris Field, the baseball park. And at the far end of the grandstand side, to the right side of your screen, you can see the chute that then became known as the Playfair chute, which was almost 6.5 furlongs if you ran all the way around the track from there. And eventually, in the late 60s and early 70s, the outer wall of the historic stands were encased in yellow siding. Racing improved, crowds grew, wagering increased, income for horse breeders, owners, trainers, jockeys, grooms, and commissionaires and concessionaires increased, and they kept on growing through the next 3 decades. And within that next decade, we have Collaborator. Here comes Collaborator, just a decade after Lighted Way. A speed-crazy but promising 1957 two-year-old in California, and disappointing the next spring, he was sold to Seattle insurance executive George C. Newell, who owned a prominent racing stable. Shipped to Long Acres, Collaborator found himself to stay, apparently. He defeated older horses in a sprint, then he won the 1-mile Spokane handicap. There's not going to be a test. Against other 3-year-olds, he went wire to wire under 126 yards to win the Long Acres Derby. And 2 weeks later, as the favorite, this 3-year-old beat the best horses on the grounds in the Long Acres Mile. Shipped to Spokane, which always opened right around Labor Day weekend, and now almost apparently unbeatable, Collaborator carried an astonishing 139 pounds and won the Spokane Derby by 8 lengths in track record time. And then he carried 137 against older horses and won the Playfair Mile by 7 lengths. He's the only horse in the same year that won the Long Acres Derby, the Long Acres Mile, the Spokane Derby, and the Playfair Mile. I returned to Spokane to become Playfair's track announcer in 1968, 4 years after a brief stretch writing sports for the Spokesman Review. Long Acres had extended its season into the fall, making it impossible for Chick O'Neill, the former jockey who had been Playfair's track announcer since the 1930s, made it impossible for him to work at both tracks. Lenny Knowles and Paul Fry, who won 6 Long Acres and 4 Playfair riding titles between them, and Richard Wright, who won 3 here and 3 more in Portland, had become the region's most successful jockeys. Trainers like Glenn Williams, Hump Roberts, Nub Norton, and Bill Cummings were big names. And the next year, I became the publicist. And here came Turbulator. What a gift. If you've ever been a publicist, you'd know about that. So I have to admit that pretty much Turbulator's success made my whole career here in Spokane. Because if I said Turbulator was a good horse and he started 7 times here and he won all 7. After that, they believed whatever I said. Almost. So, because of illness and injury, Turbulator didn't race until he was a 4-year-old. A compact but powerfully built, you can see he has an unusually powerfully developed chest. And also, he's relatively short coupled and has large hindquarters. So he was a stretch runner in especially short to medium distances all the time. And he could have, with about a 1/4 mile to go, could accelerate it at breathtaking velocity. He would go from a gallop to full speed in about 3 steps. It was really astonishing. So he started 7 times at the race, won all 7 times, including 4 stakes wins, and most of those he won with that big rally, including the Playfair Mile, and then he just basically galloped to death against inferior horses in the 2-mile Inland Empire Marathon. He should have spent that winter at Santa Anita. At major tracks, if you're coming from a secondary track, the purses are so much larger, they have what are called money conditions, which means, oh, this race is designed for 3-year-olds and upward that have never won $5,000 in a race. And $5,000 would be a stakes race in Spokane or Boise or Portland, but $5,000 is nothing in Santa Anita, where the basic purse might be $18,000 or $20,000. So Turbulator would have been available to run in all those races before he had to face any, quote, really good horses. But Tom Crawford, his trainer and part owner, and his breeder, had already had 1 heart attack, and he did not have another horse that is sufficient quality to get a stall at Santa Anita. So the 2 of them stayed home. But they rested through the winter and showed up at Long Acres in May 1970, where they met a lot of skepticism about that Spokane horse. And a few people I know. Actually, I'll interrupt myself with an anecdote. One afternoon, late in the '69 season, when Circulator had already run like 5 or 6 races, I had a Playfair parking sticker in the windshield of my car, and I stopped at what was the Shell gas station, now it's a Safe Light dealer, at the corner of, is that 3rd and one of the downtown street, Wall, maybe, or, anyway, so we're getting gasoline, and in those days the gasoline attendant actually came out and poured your gas, and he sees the sticker on my car, so I had the window rolled down to give him my credit card, and he looks at us, and he looks at the sticker, and he looks at us, and he says, "Do you know Turbulator?" And I said, "Damn straight." So at Longacres, after that speaking of that skepticism, nonetheless, Turbulator won 6 races in like 11 weeks. Although he was best at a distance, he came from far back to break the world record for 6.5 furlongs. I saw him run through deep mud to win the Joshua Green Cup. He won 2 other stakes races and almost without a doubt would have and should have won the Longacres Mile. However, the right stirrup shattered leaving the starting gate. Jockey Larry Pierce, who was regular rider, almost fell off twice. Once, his foot slipped out of the other stirrup going around the first turn and almost caused a terrible accident. Try to imagine steering a car with your knees. Only this weighs 1,000 pounds and is running fast. They nearly caused that pileup at the first turn and still became trapped bizarrely in stretch run traffic and still only lost by 3 or 4 lengths. Any other horse, Larry Pierce said, I would have just jumped off. Turbulator returned to Playfair in the fall and won another edition of the Washington State Breeders' Handicap. Then he challenged collaborators' record, carrying a record 138 pounds as he tried to win another Playfair Mile. Again, fate intervened. With the track drying from overnight rain, Tubby skidded on a wet spot just as he started to move. It took several yards for him to regain his stride, but then, accelerating with a rush, he lost by a neck. Still, for 14 months, he had been the best horse many Northwest fans had ever seen. The only horse to claim Horse of the Meeting honors at all 3 of the state's commercial tracks, Spokane, Seattle, and Yakima, a feat that cannot be mentioned. It cannot be matched, of course, because only Flemel Downs' successor to Longacres survives. The next year, Playfair became the West's first thoroughbred track. Ooh, what became of the word light? Playfair became the first track in the West to have regular night racing for thoroughbreds. Because there is no easy way to integrate them into 7 decades of Northwest racing, perhaps now's the time to mention a few words about members of the Bays family. Bert and Bob Bays came to the Yakima Valley from Oklahoma in the 1920s. They acquired a few racehorses, campaigned them among the region's many county fairs, including the Interstate Fair. Between them, they had several children, many boys. One of them became a jockey after World War II, and it was clear he was destined to be, at the least, a West Coast star in the early 1950s. Joe Bays won the 1952 Playfair at Playfair. Second, with the next year, starred at Longacres and shifted to operations to Northern California, where he won more than a share, but then he had a bad racing accident that forced him to quit. However, a decade later, hoping to make things better for his family, he returned to the saddle in 1962. He placed second at Playfair again, this is after a decade away, had a fine season at Longacres, again became a Northern California standout. His brothers, Carl and Earl, became trainers. One or both of them almost finished among the leaders at Playfair, in Portland or in Seattle. Joe's son, Russell, took up riding, moved to Northern California, and almost belonged belief up to his retirement just 5 or 6 years ago. Joe's son, Russell, ended up winning more than 7,000 races in his career. That is 3,300 more than any other jockey ever.
Wow.
And that allowed him to join Joe and later Carl's son Gary, who also had a long riding career in the Washington Racing Hall of Fame. Several of their brothers or cousins rode, and if you walk through the barn area at Emerald Downs any day this summer, you can't go far without running into a bays. Along with Cerbulator, Oregon-bred stars Ruler Swirl and Tall Ben and the Phillies' Matinee Girl Candomia were the most durable stars of the 70s and into the early 80s. And then now that we're finally in an era where the names might be more familiar, the top riders, Akifumi Kato, Jerry Takeda, and Mike James, all multiple leaders, and trainers were headed by a handful of title-winning Spokane men, almost all of them very long-term Playfair competitors, including Tom Crawford, Dutch Brandenburg, Fred Hepton, and Dan McKenna. Dan McKenna still living in his early 90s. And Kato, a native of Japan, led the generations, riding 1,104 Playfair winners alone. In 1981, Manus and his partners sold Playfair to Jack Pring, the Spokane Valley car dealer and real estate investor who had preceded Manus as a West Valley High School graduate. The next several Pring years added even more race days, and Playfair continued to thrive. As the track entered its final decades, win totals increased for the leading riders and trainers, and earnings, of course, for the stable owners and the like. And among the top jockeys of that time, the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, the new names included Jerry Pruitt, who won 3 titles, Terry Mochenberger, who won 2, Doug Moore, who starred for 3 or 4 years in a row, and then later became the executive director of the Washington Thoroughbred Breeders Association, and Scott Bertrude, all of them multiple winners right up through the mid-90s and into the early aughts. Long-term trainers Walt Tarter and Bruce Wager were joined by 2 conditioners barely out of their teens. Tom Roberts, a Long Acres trainer's son, won 3 championships in a row, and then he was succeeded by Dan McKenna's son, Tim, who won 4 in a row, starred at the new Emerald Downs, and now, as a Northern California standout, maybe within 3 or 4 weeks or less, stands 6 wins away from 2,500, which will put Tim McKenna among the American thoroughbred sports top 60 winners of all time. Black Mackey was the top 2-year-old in the whole region in 1978, being the first of that age to be named Playfair's Horse of the Meeting, only a 2-year-old, and he'd only been a $3,000 yearling, and the Spokane Futurity alone had a purse of $20,000. Here he won the Futurity by 10 lengths, and then he won the Juvenile Mile by almost 5. Injured soon afterwards, with 7 wins and 10 career starts, he retired and turned to the breeding shed. He was also a big success there. No pun intended. And in 1983, Miss Mackey, from one of his first crops of foals, taking advantage of the much longer racing season and their lucrative opportunities, the 1984 meet ran 104 days, like triple what it was when I first worked at Playfair, just 20 years before that. From the first of her 11, Miss Mackey won 11 Playfair Stakes races. On August 30th, 1986, Playfair celebrated its 50th anniversary, but they couldn't come up with something quite to do on that year, so on the 51st anniversary, they had the great Bill Shoemaker, who was the world's leading winner at that time, later broken by Lafitte Pincay, and now obviously broken by Russell Bays. Bill Shoemaker came and rode a winner and signed a lot of autographs for fans. The same year, Gray Satan earned the winner's share of the Spokane Futurity, that's 1987, which had a purse, the largest in Playfair's history ever, $62,800. And eventually, however, diminishing returns, rapidly increasing competition from card rooms, casinos, sports books, competing for many of the same dollars, and ubiquitous televised sporting events led to what has become a national shortage of thoroughbreds that has hit the whole industry hard. Jack Crane continued to operate the track for 8 seasons, then leased it to a horseman's group for 3. Electric contractor Stan Horton leased it for another 4 years, and after that, with seasons shrinking, live attendance withering, everything after that was a struggle. Nearly today, everywhere, racing survives primarily because of off-track betting. Nearly every live race at every track is televised to approved wagering sites all over the country. Lesser tracks must settle for less desirable race dates. The income may keep industry people employed, but live audiences are now almost non-existent. Where Tim McKenna is training these days at Golden Gate Field, where he's right now the leading trainer for the final meet at the track that will be destroyed this summer. The average crowd on a race day, keep in mind with nationally ranked jockeys and trainers, jockeys who have career wins of 3,000 wins and 2,500 wins, and trainers like Tim McKenna. The average attendance on a race day, 273 people. Playfair's final meet, saddled with early winter race dates, was a bust. It snowed on closing day, December 17, 2000, when the forecast called for 20 degrees. The newspaper did not report on the races. There was no Spokane Derby that year. A Nevada casino operator reopened the clubhouse for betting in 2002, but he couldn't come to a purchase agreement with the local horsemen's group. And then, for a while, the city considered using the site for a sewage treatment plant. The grandstand, barns, and offices were demolished in 2003. The city decided it didn't want the facility after all, and Spokane manufacturer Larry Stone bought the property for his company and has developed it into Playfair Commerce Park. Oops, I'm sorry. Counting available records and official estimates for the Interstate Fair and Playfair spanning 100 years with a couple years missing. Horse racing in Spokane spread over nearly 120 years, entertained almost 13 million people. Thank you. Let's see if I can show you Aki the jockey again. Yeah, that wasn't flashed on you. Flashed on you. Yeah, that was. I actually skipped by it. From Ikeda. Born in Osaka, Japan, his father was a jockey who became a trainer, and Aki came to the United States barely speaking English, and by the time he reached Playfair at the end of his apprentice year, he was still like 20 years old, learned to speak English from a Mexican groom who spoke no English either at Hollywood Park, and he was absolutely the funniest guest I ever took to the sports writers' luncheons. Everything he said was funny. He was a happy-go-lucky guy and still is, and the other picture of him that showed him in his later years, just after, he rode until he was 53, he just retired like 3 or 4 years ago with more than 2,000 wins, and he's been, he sells tack to rival jockeys, and he sells equipment, and he buys horses for owners and breeders all over the country and goes to big sales in Kentucky, and he's married to a woman from Spokane, and he's just a great guy. So, if you have questions?
Yeah, we have a question coming up, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi. Hi, Larry.
I need to borrow your noise box here. I need to make a correction here. I lived in Kentucky for 8 years, Lexington, and as much as Lexington would love to take credit for the Derby, Kentucky Derby, it's actually in Louisville.
Didn't I say that?
No.
Oh.
She didn't either.
It's just
Yeah,
down the road.
no, you didn't. One other thing is, I was lived there in the 1970s, and Secretariat won in 1974, so the 100th running of the Derby had his name on the glass.
73.
73, 74, had it on the glass. I have one at home. And my wife went to the 100th running in 74. The Secretariat, you know, he only ran for one season. Yeah, one season he was people bought shares in him, and at the end of the Triple Com, he was retired to stud. He lived at the Calumet Farm just outside of Lexington for 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 years, whatever it was after that. And when he died, they took a look at him, and they found that his heart was twice the normal size of a horse's heart.
Wow.
So every thoroughbred gets an ultrasound now to see what size that heart is. And if it doesn't measure up to Secretariat's, it goes to the glue factory or wherever they put the horses. Only the hoof. So okay. So anyway, they never wind up being quality racehorses. So that's my little dish of living in Kentucky for 8 years.
I got a question.
Yes.
Where did they ever get the names for these horses?
At least in the older days, which would mean everything before the previous, say, 20 or 25 years, most often they were named from something that were a combination of the sires and the dams' names, or their backbreeding, or something that one of their names suggested, usually. In the earliest days, many racehorses were just named after friends of the breeder. So there were a lot of horses running around with men's and women's names. Like the winner of the first Spokane Derby was named Rosa Lewis. Whoever Rosa was. Anyone else?
Tell them about the London bridges falling down. Oh, neighbors. Turbolator was one of our neighbors, and Cheryl. We all lived surrounded by horses out in the valley.
Oh, you live on Adams?
Turbolator lived
Yeah.
just
In
above
12th
us.
and Adams?
Yeah, but
No, we live between anything.
one of our neighbors below us raised racehorses, and he had a stallion inside of a pen inside of the corral. And he said to me one day, if you see any neighbor kids in there with them, there was a goat in with them, but that was all. He said, tell them not to get around the stallion. Well, one day I drove by and all the neighbor kids were under the horse singing London Bridges falling down. And he was standing there. I was scared to death till I chased them all out of the corral again.
It must not have been March or April.
We had about 10 horses, and all the neighbor kids just kind of came and went, you know, and
Well, Tom Crawford and his wife, Marguerite, knew pretty early on that Turbolator, barring bad things, and bad things turned out and happened, but he survived them when he was young, is that when he would get in the paddock with the other 3 or 4 horses they had behind their house there on Adams and 12, I guess that's 12, is that, one, he would, even as a yearling, would like race all the other horses around the paddock and try and beat them. Yeah, he was just very competitive, and as horses go, I wouldn't say he was mean, but he was not charming. And I knew him. But racehorses as a group are probably fairly bland, despite the fierce thing that some of the stallions gain. And actually, there was a small horse that raced, a small gelding, who raced at Playfair most of the time I was there originally. And he liked me like a dog and tried to climb in my arms. So he weighed 800 pounds. Anyway, thank you so much. And
So, wow, what a wonderful speech. So Jim, we wanted to honor you as one of our speakers tonight, and what we're presenting you is 2 of our Pacific Northwesterners. If you're a member, you get a Pacific Northwesterner twice a year as part of your membership. And the 2 that I'm giving you, one is on Spokane Gary, the continuing case of his land dispute, and the other one is on the person who started Millward, Seth Woodward.
great. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Talk here. We appreciate it. So next session, May 16th, we're going to have EW history professor Larry Sebula. Sebula. And he, say that again?
It's not nebula, it's
Sebula.
Sebula.
Larry Sebula.
Sebula.
He's going to be talking about the covenants and housing discrimination in Spokane. And that was recently on the news, how a title company is offering to clean up titles that have very racist talk in there and discrimination in it. So that's coming up next month. And if you're interested in being part of our executive board, our next meeting will be on Thursday, May 2nd. I'm moving it. Sierra is joining us as part of our executive board, and she can't make it on Wednesday as she works. So I moved it to Thursday at 12:30 at Frankie Doodle's. You're all invited to come and join us on that. And with that,
June, let's talk about June.
here you talk about
So June is going to be our everybody bring your memory or your favorite object or your favorite story month. And we had one quick little sign up. We got 2 people that wrote it down. It wasn't as clear because Arborcrest walked around first. I think it got everyone confused. But if you have a favorite thing, a favorite object, a favorite family story, you've got 5 minutes to tell us your story. So be thinking about what you'd like to do. We will have you sign up officially next month when we have Larry Sebula, and we will have him talk, and then we will all talk about that. He and I had a long talk, and then he sent me a little voicemail that said, "My name is not Nebula, it's Sebula." So we can say it right. I know, it's the best. So if you have a great idea for a talk, these come from you. Please tell us. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thanks for wearing your hats and all and participating in our wonderful Derby night. Thank you to the cooks. And thank you to all of the people that helped make this so special. I don't know if you all noticed, every table has the name of a winning horse on it. And this is someone's personal collection. They brought it down here and shared it with us tonight. So, oh, and the centerpieces need to stay. Please don't take those home. I'll get shot. So thank you all for coming.
Okay, I appreciate you all being here. And again, those centerpieces belong to someone else. So do not take them home, please. And with that, I have somebody. Tips. If you care to leave a tip for the waitresses, it goes to the front into the Corbin Center for itself. And Dr. Bill Young has some of his books over there for sale, and we have some of the Pacific Northwest for sale as well. All righty, thanks for being here tonight. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. All right.